example of the kind of media resonance that this work has had is the New York Times 1619 project, which relies very, very heavily on this literature for its narrative on the legacies of slavery in the American economy and society and so on. And as you probably also know, some of this criticism has already received a lot of harsh criticisms from both economic historians, but also historians more broadly. And here are just a few prominent examples of this criticism. For example, Wright dedicated basically his keynote at the Economics History Society conference in 2019, talking about this literature. Olmsted and Rhodey have a famous paper in Explorations Economic History, and their main argument is that this literature kind of lacks novelty, is inaccurate from both an historical and economic perspective at times, and so on. Hilt has also criticized this literature from the point of view that it ignores decades of cliometric research on slavery, which could really help it if they were taken into account. And then there's also a paper by Barnum and Riello, which criticizes the kind of US centrism of this literature. It's not really global history as it claims to be. Again, the history sometimes is, the chronology is just wrong. And they also criticize the focus on production, so how goods were produced rather than consumed, which is of course also a huge part of the Industrial Revolution and the coming on of modern economic growth more generally. Yet, I mean, I think because of the resonance, because of the claims they're being made, because they're drawing a lot of attention, the claims of this literature warrant a close inspection also in context other than that of the US, where most of the criticism and the attention is focused so far. So what we do basically in our paper is to focus on this other deficiency of the new history of capitalism literature, which is essentially a lack of a comparative perspective, and we bring this comparative perspective by assessing the validity of two core claims of this literature in the context of Brazil. One is that the increase in cotton productivity during, or so I should say cotton production during the second slavery, so the slavery that intensified after the Industrial Revolution, was tied to an increase in the use of violence. Okay, so it was violence that led to this big growth in cotton production that was then feeding the industries in England and elsewhere. The second claim is that slavery contributed decisively to industrialization. So we're going to analyze these two core, and I repeat, these are core claims in this literature in Brazil for the Brazilian context using quantitative data. And some of this data we have newly collected, so it's new, let's say, evidence that we're bringing to the table. It's not just the analysis. Before I move on, I also want to discuss quickly how useful Brazil can be as a counterfactual for US history. From the Brazilian side, in the Brazilian historiography, the idea that the US is an important comparison for Brazil has been, or essential point of reference is quite old and has always been the case. The US South in particular shares many characteristics with Brazil, and this has been pointed out by Graham, for example. So a plantation system based on slave labor, relatively underdeveloped industrial sector, limited urbanization, and low investment in human capital. Of course, and Graham does this, if you do like a proper comparison, you see that the US South is still more developed than Brazil right in the 19th century from many points of view, from many of these points of view, but nonetheless, they do share similar characteristics. And these parallels, these characteristics that they share are becoming more important during this second slavery, so again, this post-industrial revolution slavery that we discussed earlier. So we think we can learn not only about Brazil, but also about the US and the role of slavery in US development by studying the Brazilian case. And if you want to be really, really brave, and if you want to be very, very ambitious, you could even argue that, if slavery had been as pervasive in the United States as it was in Brazil, maybe the United States will look more like Brazil than it does. If the north of the United States was also characterized by slavery as the whole of Brazil was, then maybe the two countries will look more similar. If you want to be a bit more humble, you can just say, we're going to look at these two hypotheses regarding slavery and development in the US, and we can see how they hold up in a different and extremely important context, that of Brazil, and we also learn something about the US. So one more thing before I move on to, let's say, the more analysis and evidence proper, is talking a little bit about the new history of capitalism in Brazil. And this literature has had some traction in Brazil. So It's not like we're taking something that is completely out of context and bringing it to a context that has nothing to do with. And this literature is spoken or is ingrained in a certain traditional historiography within Brazil. And I think a lot of people agree that one of the merits of the new history of capitalism has been shifting the focus of many historians, which had lost that focus on the material back to the material. So that is something that we need to recognize. However, again, as economic historians, we are very well placed to critically assess the validity of the claims that the literature is making. And again, just to reassure that we're not just taking arguments that were made for a completely different context, in a context in which it doesn't apply. Brazilian slavery did have the characteristics which the new history of capitalism literature highlights as being indispensable for fostering modern economic growth. The Brazilian slavery had these characteristics as well, like the US one. For example, what are these characteristics? Well, transatlantic trade links between merchants and slave traders, and the use of slaves in the production of commodities such as cotton, and these apparent connections between the slave economy and industrialization. So all these characteristics are there. So we argue that it is completely valid to kind of assess the NHC claims in the Brazilian context. Okay, the last slide, kind of introductory slides before I move on. And this is just a little bit of a history of Brazilian slavery, just if you're not too familiar with what happened. So as I said before, almost 5 million Africans landed in Brazil between the 16th and 19th century, and this represented around 46% of total arrivals in the New World. So Brazil really plays an enormous role in the slave trade. Another important thing, especially from the point of view of this new history of capitalism literature, is that the slave traders who operated in Brazil were either Brazilians or Portuguese born who lived in Brazil. So this was very much a domestic affair. It's not like British merchants were bringing slaves to Brazil, okay? As I said before, plantation agriculture, of course, existed, and large plantation existed, but they were not the norm. There was a lot of small plantations. There was a lot of other types of modes of agricultural production. And as I also mentioned before, slaves were employed in almost all professions, not just on plantations, and some slaves were also highly skilled. So slavery in Brazil is really a very complex, very pervasive type of institution. Okay, cannot really put it in a box. Another characteristics that differentiates Brazilian slavery a little bit from US slavery is very high rates of manumission, so slaves being freed essentially, and low fertility. And both these things put together mean that the slave population did not grow organically. In the US, we do see this very strong organic growth, particularly in the first half of the 19th century. In Brazil, this is not the case, and slaves just keep on being imported into the country from abroad. And as a final point, I should mention that the importance of slavery was not the same throughout all these 4 or 5 centuries that it went on. It started in the northeast of the country where the sugar plantations were, but then was from the 18th century shifted to the southeast after the discovery of gold in Minas Gerais, and then stayed there essentially in the 19th century with the development of coffee production since the 1830s. And you can kind of see this reflected here in this graph, where you can see that the northeast of the country is dominating the import of slaves for a long time, and then at some point the southeast starts to grow very rapidly and takes the lead in the 19th century. Okay, so let's analyze this first claim of the literature regarding the link between slavery and industrialization. So as I said before, this is really a cornerstone of the new history of capitalism. And according to this literature, essentially slavery was central in modern economic growth, industrial development, industrial capitalism, however you want to call this. Why? Because it provided the raw materials, especially cotton. This literature really focused on cotton and cotton textiles. And also it provided investment capital for industries. So these were the two main channels according to this literature. Further contributions to industrialization were due to creation of markets, territorial expansion, and so on. But we will focus really on the first because this is more relevant in the Brazilian context. So can we actually detect a link between slavery and industrialization in Brazil? Is it there? As I said before, this literature, the NHC literature, really doesn't have much of a comparative perspective. But they do have something to say on Brazil, very briefly. Beckert in Empire of Cotton says that essentially slavery was conducive to industrialization in the US, but it was not so in Brazil. Okay, and the argument is that in Brazil there was just too much slavery. Slavery was too pervasive, and somehow they switched slavery from being conducive to industrialization, as in the US case, to being bad for industrialization, as in the Brazilian case. So as you will see, we kind of agree with Becker's conclusion here, and we bring new evidence to them. So we do agree that slavery was very probably bad for Brazilian industrialization. However, we do find it a bit post hoc reasoning to say that, oh, you know, in the US, industrialization took off, so slavery was good for it. In Brazil, it didn't take off, so slavery was bad for it. We would like to see a little bit more of an explanation why this is the case, but let's leave that aside for a second. We mostly agree with this conclusion by Beckert here. Again, even Becker's conclusion does not really rely on quantitative evidence. It's mostly relying on historiography in Brazil, which has some limited or very small, geographically small scale evidence. So what are we going to do is to zoom in on two key neighboring southeastern provinces slash states in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, and we're going to analyze this link between manufacturing and slavery. Particularly, we're going to look at manufacturing employment as our indicators of industrialization. So why do we want to focus on these two provinces in particular? The main reason is that these two provinces were very important in Brazilian industrialization. They were relatively early industrializers within Brazil. Their industrialization already starts in the 1870s or even a little bit earlier. And by the early 20th century, both states had a modern, sizable manufacturing sector. We can actually take a look at how this manufacturing sector looked like in this map, which we've put together based on data from 1907, published in 1909. And you can see here, this is Sao Paulo, and this on the right is Rio. And then there is all the different industries, and you can see that the industry was relatively widespread, and there was a wide variety. We have textiles, foodstuffs that are very important. We have also metal, chemicals, and other types of production. And the reason I should just mention why this part of Sao Paulo has very little manufacturing establishment, or in this case, almost none, is because this was really almost newly settled territory. So until the mid to late 19th century, this territory still was not really settled. And that's why we have this slow but steady expansion towards the northwest of the state. So we're not going to look only at industrial employment in general. We're going to also focus on the textile industry. Why the textile industry? Well, many accounts of industrialization, the textile industry is considered very important in the early stages of industrialization. So we're going to look at the textile industry. And this industry is, of course, also very important within the new history of capitalism, because they really put a lot of focus on it. And as you can see from this table, here you have different states in Brazil and how many factories they had, how much capital they had invested, how much production they had, how many workers they had employed in the textile industry. You can see that even in this industry, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro are second and third most important states in the country. The most important in 1907 is the city itself of Rio de Janeiro, which we exclude from our analysis because this was a separate political entity, has a very peculiar history because it's the capital of the country, is the main port through which slaves enter, especially in the 19th century. So we really think it's an outlier. So we're gonna leave it out of the analysis, but the two states, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, are really important players in this textile industry, both in terms of capital, production, number of workers, and so on. Okay. As I said, by the 20th century, both states had a modern, sizable manufacturing sector. But then, you know, as the 20th century progresses a little bit, the Paulista, the Sao Paulo industry keeps on growing faster than the Rio counterpart. And eventually it becomes the country's most important industrial powerhouse. And many have argued that coffee played an important role in Brazilian industrialization. So Sao Paulo is the main producer of coffee by the late 19th century in Brazil. And as a consequence, is the main producer of coffees within the world, because Brazil is exporting most of the coffee in the world. And this is particularly important because essentially the proceeds that come from coffee production, the foreign exchange, are then used to invest into machines, into construction of railroads, and so on. Okay, and this echoes arguments that have been made in the new history of capitalism literature about the role of cotton in the US. So cotton generating these profits that then are reinvested in the industrial sector. However, the most quantitatively important and dynamic phase of the coffee boom that happens in Sao Paulo actually happens after the abolition of slavery, okay? And was concentrated in Sao Paulo, which was the state out of the two which had relatively less slaves, okay, as we will see in a second. Rio instead, the country that, the state that then grew less fast than Rio actually relied more on slave labor and kept relying more on slave labor throughout the 19th century until the abolition of slavery in 1888. So we can see basically in numbers what I've been saying so far. So here the the left graph is absolute numbers and the right graph is numbers relative to population. So here the black bar is the total number of slaves in 1872. That's where we have data because that's when the census was carried out. And you can see that Rio de Janeiro, despite being smaller than Sao Paulo, has many more slaves. At the same time, it has much less manufacturing employment. So you can see here, this light gray bar here, that Sao Paulo has about twice as many manufacturing employees already in 1872 as compared to Rio. In 1920, both in Rio and Sao Paulo, the number of manufacturing employees, it's a rapid phase of industrialization, goes up quite a lot. But still, Sao Paulo maintains its lead in this case. Now, if we look in relative terms, we can see that again, Rio de Janeiro has much more slaves than Sao Paulo, even more in relative terms because it has a smaller population. And we can see again that in terms of manufacturing employment, Sao Paulo has an early lead in 1872. Then in relative terms, Rio de Janeiro catches up. So it also has a strong industrial development, but Sao Paulo in terms of absolute number, absolutely remains the most important manufacturing center. And the fact that the share of manufacturing employment in the total population goes down a little bit is actually a testimony to the fact that the industrial sector is mechanizing, but also to the fact that the economy of Sao Paulo is diversifying into other sectors such as services, finance, and so on. Okay, so this was a very broad analysis that if we compare the two states, the one that has more slavery and relies most on slaves does worse from the point of view of industrialization. But of course, this is just a very simple comparison. We want to do something a little bit more systematic. Okay, I want to do a more thorough systematic analysis of the relationship between slavery and industrialization, and we'll use municipal level data to do that. So what we're going to do is to run some regressions, and there's no fancy identification strategy here. We're just looking for patterns in the data. Okay, so what we're going to do is run regressions with manufacturing employment and textile employment as the two dependent variables. And we're going to do this in 1872, so when slavery was still there and was still going strong, and then in 1920. The reason why we choose these two specific dates is simply because that's when Brazil managed to actually carry out censuses, so we have the data. They tried to carry out censuses in between these two dates, but they never really worked out. So you're going to see two sets of regressions, one for 1872 and one in 1920. And in the first column of each set, we're going to have the dependent variable regressed on the share of slaves in the population of each municipality. And then the second column is going to include a lot of controls, with which we want to account for different aspects of the industrialization process. First of all, we want to control for agricultural specialization. It might be that some municipalities are simply better suited for agriculture rather than industrial production. And this is, of course, also going to be related to slavery, so we don't want to confound the two things. So we're going to control for how many people are employed in agriculture. We're going to control for how many immigrants there are in a municipality, because the Brazilian historiography tells us that immigration is an enormously important force in Brazilian development and industrialization. We're going to control for human capital in the form of literacy. We're going to control for coffee production. So we're going to see which municipalities produce coffee, and we're going to split these municipalities in the ones that started producing coffee early, so while slavery was still there, and the ones that started producing after slavery was over. We're also going to control for other things that have been pointed out to be very important for Brazilian development and industrial development, such as access to railway, distance from the port. And then we're also going to control for inequality, because it's kind of a way to capture the concentration. It's going to be land inequality. So it's a way to capture the concentration of lands in a few people. And the concentration of land is also related to concentration of slaves in the hands of the same people. Okay, but unfortunately, inequality we can only measure in 1920 and not in 1872 because of data restrictions. So this is not going to play a big role in our story. So here are the results. I hope you can see them and it's not too small. So what we can see here is that for 1872, the number of workers per 1,000 inhabitants is negatively related to how many slaves there are in the population in 1872. And you can see that this is true, and actually the coefficient becomes even stronger if we control for all the variables that I just mentioned to you. Okay, so share of workers in agriculture, immigrants, and so on. Essentially what this is telling us, and there is no causal claim here, is simply that in places with more slaves, there is less manufacturing employment, even after we control for this agricultural tendency of the municipality. So what happens if we fast forward to 1920, so after abolition, after there has been this strong industrial development within Brazil, what we see is that the coefficient, if we don't control for anything else, turns positive, even though it's statistically not significant. So it would appear, oh, maybe there is a positive connection between the past of slavery and manufacturing employment later on. But actually, once you control for the same variables as before, we actually see that the coefficient becomes negative again, even though it's very small. It's basically zero. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be any association between past slavery and industrial employment in 1920. However, what is really interesting is to look at how these other coefficients change between 1872 and 1920. So what we see here, for example, is that the share of immigrants in 1872, and again, the historiography tells us how important immigration was for industrial development in Brazil. You can see this is actually weakly negatively related to manufacturing employment in 1872, and that's because early immigrants were not working in the factories. They were mostly working on coffee plantations. But then we see that even if we use the immigrants' numbers from 1872, so leaving alone the successive huge inflow of immigrants that happened starting from the 1880s and 1890s, we can see that places that received more immigrants up to 1872 had much more manufacturing employment in 1920. The same thing is true for literacy. Here the coefficient is positive, but it's simply not measured precisely enough to be significant, but we can see in 1920, literacy is in 1872, again, is very clearly related to manufacturing employment. Another interesting result is for these coffee producer dummies. So this is the early coffee producers, the ones that started producing coffee before abolition of slavery, and these are the ones that started producing after the abolition of slavery. And we can see that we don't find any association between coffee production and manufacturing employment before abolition, but after abolition, we see that these municipalities actually become relatively important manufacturing centers. Okay, so essentially what this is telling us, and I will summarize in a few slides, is that it's a bit of a story of wasted potential. Okay, and in delaying the manufacturing or the industrial employment that some of these municipalities might have had there been no slavery. But before I go a little bit deeper into this, let me show you the results for textile employment. And textile employment, I should mention, is not a huge share of manufacturing employment, particularly in 1920. So there is no guarantee that we're going to find similar results to the ones that we find for overall manufacturing employment. So this is not a redundant exercise to look at the textile the textile industry separately. But essentially, we do find very similar results. We find this negative association between slavery in 1872 and textile employment in 1872. Here, the story about the immigrants is even stronger. We see a very strong and negative relationship, a statistically significant relationship between immigrants in 1872. It's negative in 1872 and positive and strongly so in 1920. But again, we find similar results for literacy, coffee production, and so on. So the results are similar, but again, there's no guarantee that they will be so. So how do we interpret these results? First of all, from just purely a quantitative perspective, a 1 standard deviation increase in the share of slaves in 1872, so this is about 11 percentage points, approximately leads to 1/5 of a standard deviation lower employment in manufacturing and textile manufacturing. The two are quantitatively similar in 1872. So from a quantitative perspective, this is not negligible. And then how do we interpret this change in the other coefficients? Essentially, we see it as abolition of slavery, allowing municipalities to exploit their potential to become manufacturing centers. So things like a large immigrant labor force, literacy, capital, or other things coming from producing coffee. It might be population density, for example. So all these things are not able to help these municipalities be manufacturing centers early on, but they allow them to be so later on, once slavery has been abolished. However, this early distortion that we see in the allocation of capital, in the allocation of, or the spatial distribution of manufacturing activity, which is due to slavery, made it slow down or altogether hindered Brazil's overall development as an industrial nation. So there's no guarantee that this catch-up that we see later on did in no way harm the Brazilian overall industrial development. And, for example, for textile, the story of this wasted early potential might be particularly important, because we know that the early mills, the ones that were established in the 1870s or even earlier, so very early in the industrialization phase, actually dominated the successive increase in productive capacity of the Brazilian textile industry in the early 20th century. Okay, so basically what this is telling us is that any distortion that we see in the allocation of manufacturing capacity, capital, and so on, that was due to slavery, may have continued in a path-dependent way during Brazil's industrial boom, which was the phase leading up to World War I. Okay. So that's it for industrialization. I don't see any clarification questions, so I'll just move on. And now I will talk about the relationship between slavery and cotton. As I said before, cotton is really important for the new history of capitalism literature. There's the idea that it was a fundamental input into the industrialization process. We know that the story is more complex. In England, it was not just the cotton sector that was growing a lot. There was other sectors that were actually growing more. But of course, from an export perspective, cotton was hugely important in the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and we can see it in the fact that the mechanization of textile production following the Industrial Revolution in England leads to a strong cotton demand growth. Okay, so Brazil in this phase is very well positioned actually, and the Northeast supplies around 40% of the cotton imported to Liverpool during the 1790s. So it's not really the U.S. as the NHC literature seems to claim that is important in the early phases of industrialization in England is actually Brazilian cotton. Of course, other sources are important too. There's further demand growth in the 19th century. However, we see after the 1820s that Brazilian cotton exports stagnate. And the traditional explanation for these stagnations is that the US is becoming much better at growing cotton. There's productivity growth in the US. And at the same time, there's a shrinking slave workforce in Brazil, which is due to the coffee boom in the Southeast. So essentially, coffee, according to the story, is absorbing slave labor from the cotton regions and the sugar regions into the coffee regions. However, this story doesn't really hold up because we see that cotton exports, not only in the US, but also in other producers, such as Egypt and the East Indies, also grow strongly in this period. Okay, so the story of just the US dominating world markets doesn't really seem to hold up. Also, we see that slave transfer to the Southeast are absent or very limited, at least until the 1840s. So really until the coffee boom gets going for real, because in the 1830s, it's very slow to get going, the coffee sector, or it's very, very early stages. So the story of labor does not really hold up for the decades before the 1840s. And finally, as a piece of evidence, the number of this share of slaves in the population in cotton-producing areas in Brazil is comparable to that of the U.S. So it does not seem to be the case that is a superior or larger slave labor force that is leading to these results. So what happens next is the American Civil War. The American Civil War is very important for Brazilian cotton because it leads to a resurgence of exports. So they go up in 1 year, they more than double, for example, between 1861 and 1862. And there's further increase in successive years. And this boom goes on until the early 1870s, essentially. So how was this huge increase in production achieved? So part of the story is just expansion in new territory. So it's just extensive growth. For example, Sao Paulo, which was not exporting cotton before this period, now starts exporting cotton. And importantly, or interestingly, this is mostly produced using free labor. But we're not going to look at Sao Paulo for cotton because most of the action here is happening not in the southeast, not in the coffee producing industrializing regions, but it's still the northeast of the country. Okay, the northeast cotton regions remain dominant. They produce 88% of exports during this boom between 1863 and 1872. So these are areas that traditionally, at least in general, used a lot of slaves. So could it be that this pushing system that has been suggested by Baptist for the US context, and this is an increase in violence combined with new cotton varieties, explain this growth in Brazilian exports, this growth in Brazilian production of cotton. And again, importantly, Brazil exhibits the characteristics suggested by Baptist to be ideal or to be essential for this system to work. So Brazil, as we have seen into the 19th century, access to relatively cheap slaves, to a lot of slaves and relatively cheap slaves, cheaper than in the US. And the Brazilian slavery is no less brutally exploitative than the American one. So essentially the conditions are there for an increase in violence to lead to more production, to higher productivity on Brazilian plantations, as Baptist argues happens on US plantations. The first suggestion that the Baptist story might not apply in Brazil, and by the way, people are already showing it doesn't really apply to the US, but maybe it does apply to Brazil, but the first indication that it does not comes from this table. So here we have northeastern provinces in Brazil. They're important cotton producers, and we can see how much their production grows both in terms of value and in tonnage between the period 1858 to 62 and 1863 to 72. And we can see that there is a strong growth in a lot of states. Some of the states have cotton as their main export. Some of the states have cotton not as a main export, for example, Bahia. And some of these states use a lot of slaves. For example, Maranhão has very intensive slave-based cotton production. But for example, here we have Ceará, which doesn't have a lot of slaves. And as we will see later, slaves are now actually used intensively or almost at all in cotton production.
Andrea, maybe if you can try to finish in 5 minutes approximately.
Yeah, I should be able to do that. Yeah, that's not a problem. I might go 2 minutes over, but I'll try to finish quickly. So as you can see here, basically, whether the province had a lot of slaves or not, they all managed to increase their production in this period. So we want to do, again, as we did before for industrialization, a more systematic comparison. So what we're going to do is compare the slave-intensive, the slave-based production of Maranhão with the free labor-based production of Ceará. So these were neighboring provinces with strong specialization in cotton, both of them. And we have ample evidence of the introduction of seeds from the United States even prior to Civil War in cotton production. Okay, so we have these new seed varieties that are supposedly complementary with violence. So all the conditions are there for the pushing system to work. Okay, for this increase in violence complemented by new cotton varieties to really be leading the increase in cotton production. So what we expect is that the slave-intensive Maranhão would have a stronger growth in cotton production compared to Ceará, which is not slave-intensive. If we go back to the data from the previous value and focus on these two states, just Ceará and Maranhão, we can see that actually the growth in production, both in value and tonnage, is much larger in Ceará compared to Maranhão. So Ceará exports grow by 5.5% in terms of value, 4.5 times, and 2.5 times in terms of tonnage, and the growth in Maranhão is much smaller. Now you could say that perhaps, okay, the average number of slaves are lower in Ceará, but maybe the slave population is concentrated in the cotton producing areas. Now we can see in this map that indeed here the white dots are cotton plantations, and the shading, the darker shady area have more slaves. we can see that in Maranhão, the slaves are indeed mostly concentrated in the cotton producing areas, but this is not the case in Ceará. So the cotton plantations are in areas that are basically in the average share of slaves in the province, and in any case, in areas that have less than 10% of slaves as a share of the population. So really cotton, and we also have, besides this quantitative evidence, we have a lot of historical evidence that basically tells us that Ceará cotton production happened with free labor in opposition to Maranhão, which was slave-based. So the next thing that we can look at is whether, is this just extensive growth? This increase in cotton production, is it just extensive growth? Is it just more labor inputs that are being put, both free and unfree labor, that can explain this increase? What we can see here is that the top panels are for Ceará and the bottom panels are for Maranhão, and we can see that despite the fact that there is this boom in cotton production, cotton producing areas are not receiving more population than other areas. So it's not that this booming sector is particularly attracting large number of workers that can really explain this increase in production. But we can see that actually cotton producing areas even see a decrease between 1860 and 72 in the number of slaves, okay? In Maranhão, the story is similar. We see an increase in population in both cotton and non-cotton producing areas, and we actually see a small decrease in the number of slaves that are working in cotton producing areas. So if really these new seeds combined with violence are explaining this big increase in cotton production, you would expect that now suddenly, there's more of a comparative advantage to produce cotton with slaves, but this does not seem to be the case because these areas are not attracting more slaves. And I can conclude by saying that a lot of the slaves that are leaving Maranhão in here are not just being sold off to a coffee plantation in the southeast, but also often manumitted, so set free. So it really seems that slavery is not the essential input here. So summing up, and then I'll try to conclude, there's a strong growth in cotton production, both in provinces relying on slave labor and those that did not. And this suggests that this pushing system suggested by Baptist was not its ultimate cause. We also see no systematic difference in labor inputs growth between cotton and non-cotton producing regions, and even a decrease in the case of slaves. As in the case of the US, which I mentioned before, which was analyzed by Olmsted and Rhodey, new cotton varieties coming from the US are likely at least part of the cause in the increase in productivity in Brazilian plantations, and probably not all the growth that we see is just more labor inputs or more land put to produce cotton. So there is some productivity growth, and it might be due to these new seeds that are coming from the US. So I'm gonna skip this part. This is about what we actually know that slavery did in Brazil, and it's many bad things. But I will skip this part. We can go back to it later if there are questions. Let me come to the conclusions. What we did was to analyze these two core claims of the new history of capitalism literature, that violence caused the increase in cotton production during the second slavery, and that slavery was essentially for industrialization, and found no support for these hypotheses in the Brazilian context. So what we conclude is not only was slavery abhorrent from a modern or even a 19th century normative perspective, but it was only economically beneficial for a small elite, and it actually damaged the rest of society, which is the part that I didn't have time to discuss. So if there is a positive relationship between slavery and development in Brazil, this would require finding some other unique missing link that has not been hypothesized or discussed in the historiography or detected in the empirical literature, but the mechanisms, the channel proposed by the NHC literature definitely don't cut it. And as a final general point, we would say that both the new history of capitalism and the broader literature on slavery should take a comparative perspective more seriously, because we think we can learn a lot from this. So that's it. Thank you very much. Obrigado and gracias, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This was fascinating. Now we go to the discussions, to the questions. I think you probably can take questions in Spanish and Portuguese. Yeah.
Yes.
Or you
yes. I might ask you to translate if I really don't understand, but I'll try to understand.
Good. So I would say if you want to ask questions, please raise your hand. We also have the rest of the co-authors of the paper here, Nuno, Thales, and Leonardo. And we will probably take some time after 5 because we started a little bit late. So we can now start. There is a question by Pablo. Pablo, whenever you want. Everybody has the capacity to talk, so you can use the microphone. So Pablo, whenever you want.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you
Hi,
for
Pablo.
the presentation, for the paper. And the topic very stimulating and interesting. I'm a bit, as a first reaction, I'm a bit, I don't know, I'm a bit puzzled about the framing because you are studying a relevant thing, I think, and you are framing it as a new history of capitalism, and this is the whole of your work. But I don't know. This is a personal choice, but I don't know is this really the audience that you are talking because talking at. Many there may be many channels in mainstream economic history by which you can connect slavery with development. So you may think of local institutions, human capital, trust, and the like, right? And therefore, I don't know. I found it strange because either you are talking to standard economic or mainstream economic historians, as I guess most of us are, who may be aware of this new history of capitalism, but you may not take it. It's like overshooting a bit, or otherwise, I don't know. Given the methodological differences with these people, convincing them either. But nonetheless, apart from this,
Pablo, maybe you can talk. Pablo, maybe you can talk closer to the microphone.
Okay, now better.
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. We have this new history of capitalism, but really worth focusing on them when addressing a topic with. This is a general reaction. Then one thing related to if they are claiming that the mechanism by which is operating at the local level. So of observation that you are using is the relevant the one for their story, in particular if you are in their terms. And a part of this, I have two small questions because I was a bit surprised by the lack of slavery in the 1920s level of development.
The lack of what? Sorry, I didn't understand.
The lack of correlation between slavery intensity and nation in the 20s.
Yes.
Right. And I was thinking in terms of how because you said that that was also relevant in non-agrarian employment, and I don't know if there may be some lack of precision in slavery measures owing to, I don't know, domestic service slavery, and this may be biased a bit downwards, your coefficient. I was thinking in terms of internal migration. By 1920s, I mean, if you have a allocation with slaves half a century before, these may have moved, and capital is well, and so on. So, and also you mentioned that slavery was much like a Roman slavery, right, with a lot of manumission. So you may expect that once slaves become free, where they where they earn high, and therefore where the labor is more productive. So I would you may take this into account, or whether this may to highlighting some potential. I mean, this result will be surprising. The lack of impact in the 20s, but no, I mean, also credible. No, I'm not just making sense of this, okay? Because I don't know if it's entirely of missing opportunities or simply, yeah, places because people move, and so yeah. Thank you anyway. These were my comments.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. So I'll try to remember everything you said. So the first point about the framing. So I think we think, and this project started with this spirit. There are attempts to try and bridge the mainstream economic history literature to these new literature, and these new self-styled new history of capitalism. And I think these are worthwhile, and this project kind of started like that to bring this comparative perspective to that. Of course, as we kind of went on the project, it became something more than that, because we brought new data into the picture, new analysis. And I know there are the methodological differences, but hopefully the message that we bring here will also speak to people working in this literature. And I think, again, because this literature is having a lot of attention, maybe not in our circles, but even though, Gavin Wright dedicated his whole, keynote to the 2019 conference, so obviously it's having an impact on our profession as well. I think it's worth try to see what these people have to say. Is there anything of value? Is there something that we can really learn from this? And these two hypotheses that we analyzed struck us as, plausible for the Brazilian context, interesting to analyze. So we took that as kind of a cue to then go on and do our own analysis, and to do something that hadn't really been done in the Brazilian historiography or economic history literature. So I think we try to contribute both from this bridging the gap and understanding this literature better, but also just speaking to, let's say, mainstream economic historians. So hopefully, we managed to do both. The second point, or at least I don't know, I think there was 3 points, but now I'm blanking on the second. But the third one was about this 1920. And I mean, I don't think it's so surprising, this result, because if these places that produced a lot of coffee with slaves, or in general places that we're already connected to the export economy because of agricultural goods, if they then re-specialize into manufacturing, they're potentially able to catch up later. That doesn't mean that the ground they lost earlier on because of slavery, because of the agriculture focus that they had early on, is not damaging overall for Brazilian industrialization. And I think the fact that these places, places that were producing coffee earlier on, do have a strong growth in manufacturing later, does suggest that there was a wasted opportunity earlier on. And Brazil is already a late industrializer, right? So the more time you lose, the worse it is for the eventual result of the industrialization process, right? The catching up may become quicker, but it might never be fully realized. So I think and the things that you mentioned, of course, are all happening. Internal migration is happening. Capital is moving. That is all definitely happening. The economic geography of Brazil is changing very strongly between 1872 and 1920. But hopefully, our data is not panel data. We're looking at two cross-section, but hopefully, what we're trying to do is kind of capture these changes that are happening and how they might be related to slavery. I still don't remember if there was another point that you made, but we can also chat later on. Or you can send me an email. I'll be very happy to further discuss this.
Okay, yes. It was agrarian slavery as against
well,
other forms of
we haven't
slavery.
done, but we can control for how many slaves were employed in agriculture versus other professions. We haven't tried to do that. We can do that. It's very easy.
It's interesting since you mentioned that this was a key distinction with a key difference in the US. So this, I don't know, found evocative. Nonetheless, do not find this comment as a critique. It's just a reaction.
No,
I
know.
Eventually, something which is interesting in itself, and you may eventually speak to this nonetheless. So, but I'm still a bit, a bit of perplexity, giving it too much weight. But of course,
I understand what you mean.
Thank you, Pablo. I think we moved to the next question by Mario Cuenda.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Hi.
I have a little comment and then more like a question. Well, on the comment, it's more on the same line than Pablo, but I am really much looking forward whether you can push in the future about the channels linking and the mechanism linking slavery and industrialization in Brazil. I think that the regressions already show some very interesting correlation, but those are 50 years where a lot of things obviously happen in Brazil, and it would be very interesting to see what is the mechanism. The second thing is more of the understanding I had from the new history of capitalism and the relationship between slavery and industrialization is that that slavery benefited industrialization, but not generally in the country where slavery was happening. I mean, in the sense that a lot of cotton was picked up in fields where slavery was present, but who was benefiting of that cotton and of industrialization was generally, well, the UK, for instance, right? And you showed some data on how cotton was sent to the UK, and we know also that from Egypt and from the US. So I wonder whether it shouldn't be about looking, I mean, whether the focus of the question should be different and maybe looking at how states interact. And I was interested about the fact that Sao Paulo had more slavery than Rio, and Rio was a bit more industrialized. So
no, it's the
you
opposite.
understand what I mean? You understand what I mean? That it's
no, I don't understand. I understand. But it's the opposite. Sao Paulo is more industrialized.
Sorry. I had it the other way around.
It's fine.
What I mean is, from what I understood from the literature, is that slavery benefited industrializations in some other parts because there was exploitation in those countries. So I don't know if you could find something also within states in Brazil where, I don't know, between cotton trade could have had an impact on industrialization on one hand and not on the other.
No, I understand what you mean. And this kind of links back, I think, to what I now remember Pablo was saying earlier, because, you know, the story is not necessarily at the municipal level. It's more like bigger units, like, you know, the north and south of the US, or US and England and so on. Like, the issue here is that, okay, you know, there is, like, you know, in the US, you have this very clear distinction. You have the South, which is agrarian and slave-based, and the North, which is industrial, right? And then they make the argument that there is, you know, the capital and cotton from the South are feeding into the industrial complex in the North. Okay, I'm not going to go into the US case because this has been talked about by a lot of people, and you know, these kind of links have been, you know, discredited and so on. But the issue is that, you know, Brazil is more complex because slavery is everywhere. There's no place where there is no slavery. At the same time, slavery is also, industrialization is also taking place where there is slavery. So in Sao Paulo and in Rio. Okay, so there are both slaves and industrialization happening at the same time. So I think then it becomes interesting to explore whether it is a connection between the two. So if I'm a plantation owner and I make a lot of money because of slavery, and I have to invest it in another economic activity, I'm going to invest it, you know, within my own state, right? Because that's where industrialization is happening, because they're already living in Rio or in Sao Paulo. So from just figuring out these links is very hard from a quantitative perspective in the Brazilian context. But from the historiography, we don't have any evidence or even narrative evidence of this kind of happening. And as I was mentioning before, actually, what we know most about is the profits coming from the second wave of coffee production, the one that happens after the abolition of slavery. These ones we can link much more clearly to industrialization. So, you know, I think we don't see in Brazil these profits made in one place, thanks to slavery, going to another place for it to industrialize. We don't see this. So then the next question is, can we find some other link between industrialization and slavery? Is there a link at the local level between the two things? And we don't find it, or we find actually evidence pointing the other way. So it's a little bit reframing the question, I guess, from what you're saying, but I think it's still a question within that causal argument that this literature is making. I don't know if I answered your question clearly.
It's fine. I mean, it was kind of a question, also like a comment. So I'm happy with your answer. Thank you.
Okay, happy to discuss further as with Pablo.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions by the audience? One thing I was wondering is it's kind of indirectly related to the paper, but I was wondering if there is any take-home message about the political economy of slavery in Brazil that we should end this webinar with, like why it survived so long, who was kind of sustaining it, if it wasn't really that associated to increasing productivity, etc.
Well, I think this question is a great question. I think it's a little beyond my ability to answer. I don't know if Leo, Thales, or Nuno want to jump in as well. I think slavery, as in the U.S., was clearly profitable for the people who owned slaves, and it was for a long time. It's the Brazilian story does resemble a little bit this Williams thesis, where essentially the economy advances so much at some point and it kind of outgrows the need for slaves to do the things that it needs to do. But there's a clear story of local oligarchs who own a lot of slaves, influenced both local politics and national politics, at least until the fall of the monarchy in 1889. So there's definitely connections. There's definitely a political economy story going on. We don't really go into this in this paper, but it's definitely a very, very interesting thing.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, of course, let's go.
Yeah, we don't offer an answer to that question, but I think this kind of work because the new history of capitalism interpretation, especially for the US, is becoming more and more common in Brazilian analysis. So we're decided to jump in and trying to make a more consistent analysis than the one that we saw until now. And to answer Alfonso's question is, I think we offer a very broad evidence to the standard interpretation. That is that slavery lasted long in Brazil because it was profitable, but it was profitable for a very small group of people. So slavery is the main reason that for why we have such high inequality in Brazil, right? So that's everybody knows that, but we're offering a little bit more evidence to that narrative. I think it's the only kind of good answer that I can give right now.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Okay, so we are more or less 1 hour from the start, so I think we can finish here. And I really appreciate that you accepted the invitation, and thank you for this great presentation, the discussions. Sorry for the technical problems at the beginning. I don't know what happened with Zoom, but yeah, thank you very much. This was a great presentation, a great paper. Thank you all the co-authors also.
Thank you.
Alfonso, and very fast, I would like to say I'm very sorry, Andrea, that I couldn't be here to start and moderate the session. I had a little medical emergency. I'm right now here. I'm okay.
Okay.
No worries. I really couldn't arrive on time. I'm sorry.
No worries. I hope everything is okay.
Thank you very much. And of course, Alfonso did it great, as always. So thank you, Alfonso, and I'm sorry, Andrea.
Thank you, Sandra. So we say goodbye, and the next webinar will be in 2 weeks from now, from Aurora Gómez Galvarriato from Colegio de México. So I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.